Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another episode of Jumah Nights. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode where we spoke about Wilayah Takwiniya. Today we want to open up a new topic in our series of the maqamat of the Imams, and today we're going to be speaking about Istighatha. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. So the discussion about Istighatha is one that has become very popularized these days on the minbar, on the internet, and one that's quite controversial, and a lot of doubt has been casted upon it, especially with regards to Istighatha through Ahlulbayt alayhim salam. Many people for this reason have started to ask a lot of questions in relation to this concept. So what we always do on Jum'ah Nights, as I've always said, is we provide a basic foundational overview over the topic, and inshallah that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to discuss this in 3 points. After defining what Istighatha is, number 1, we're going to speak about, can Istighatha be considered as shirk? Number 2, where do we see Istighatha in the Qur'an and Ahadith? And number 3, we're going to be speaking about the concept of ziyarah and previous episodes of Jum'ah Nights that may provide some further context to this topic. So the first question to ask here is, what is Istighatha? A lot of us are familiar with the term tawassul, and tawassul loosely translates to intercession and in the general sense. So the first question to ask is, what is Istighatha? A lot of the time this term is used specifically because it refers to a specific concept within tawassul, which is the general form of intercession. So if we were to define tawassul, we would define it as a general form of asking for intercession through an individual. A lot of the time now, there's a clear differentiation made between tawassul and Istighatha, and that is for a specific purpose, because tawassul can refer to any kind of intercession, as we have mentioned. And for example, if I was to say, "Oh Allah, grant me this and this thing for the sake of Muhammad wa al-Muhammad," that would be a normal form of intercession, and that is also considered to be tawassul. But it's not considered to be Istighatha. The thing that is specific about Istighatha is where we speak to the individual themselves. So I would say, for example, "Ya Muhammad, grant me this and this and this," or "Ya Muhammad, ask Allah to grant me this and this." So that is where the problem comes. The Istighatha is where we speak to the individual themselves, and that is the contention that has been raised by many individuals with regards to this specific concept. So today we want to discuss, is this Istighatha concept found in our religion, or is it not found in our religion? So we want to discuss that first by looking into, can it be considered to be shirk? And that is the first question. We have to understand, first of all, is it a viable claim to claim that Istighatha can lead to shirk, or that Istighatha is shirk? And I want to put a disclaimer out here that this is not a Sunni Shia debate. A lot of the time people think that Istighatha is a Shia thing and the Sunnis disagree with it. That's not the case. A lot of the time you'll see, even amongst the opposing sects, they will have debates with regards to, is Istighatha allowed in the religion? Is it shirk or is it not? And there are very famous debates, even in recent contemporary times, on YouTube, for example, where you'll be able to see that there are 2 members from the Ahlul Sunnah who are discussing this topic. So this is not a Sunni Shia discussion. And the same way you'll see in the Shia communities, where there are people that are saying that Istighatha is allowed, and there will be other people within the same Shia community saying that it is allowed. So you'll see these disagreements regardless of which sect you are in. It is not a polemical sect-based discussion, rather just a concept in itself that is disagreed upon. And by the way, this phenomenon of disagreeing with Istighatha within the Shia world is something that's very recent and contemporary. It's something that has only really popped up in the last few years. But anyways, with regards to shirk, right, many scholars have written that there are 3 things that can be committed shirk within. They have written that the first of them is the essence of Allah, the second of them is the actions and attributes of Allah, and the third is the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's either in relation to the essence. So for example, if I say with regards to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I say that Allah is composite, if I say Allah has a hand and that hand is different to his leg, and all of this is part of the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I've made him composite, and for that reason that would become shirk. So that's shirk in the essence of Allah, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or for example, the second example is the attributes or the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I take those attributes and I, in their infiniteness, in their way that they are specific to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, take that and I give that to somebody else, and I say that this person is also Ar-Rahman in the same way that Allah is Ar-Rahman. And that's why we see that even in fiqh, naming somebody Ar-Rahman is haram, because that is an attribute that is specific to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's why we see that this name or these attributes, there are those which are specific to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that cannot be attributed to anybody else. So that's a second form of shirk, or the second thing that you can do shirk in. And within the discussion with regards to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I attribute one of his creations to his essence, that would also be shirk. For example, we have a hadith from Imam Rida alayhi salam where he says that whomsoever claims that the irada, the will of Allah, is from the essential attributes of Allah, then he is not a muwahhid, he is not a monotheist. So he's saying that this misconception with regards to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can also lead to shirk if I apply or attribute one of his creations to him. So that's another form of shirk. And the third one is with regards to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I do an act of worship towards somebody else, or I make them equal with Allah in that respect. So all of these forms of shirk are with regards to making equal other people with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any of these three things: the essence of Allah, the attributes of Allah and his actions, or his worship, making someone else equal in your worship towards them, to Allah and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we see that shirk is defined by making something equal to Allah in their independence or in their power, and creating a status for them that is the same as the status of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So can Istighatha fall into this? So then if I told you that Allah granted the ability to some of his close servants to be able to hear and fulfill the needs of people, would that be able to fall under any of those categories of shirk? The answer is that when we look at all of these categories of shirk, they are all things that are rationally impossible. Shirk is something, if you look closely, why is shirk considered to be the biggest sin in the Qur'an? Is because these are sins that are rationally impossible. These are things that you can actually think about. Every human has the faculty of rationality. They have the faculty to be able to think rationally and be able to make logical decisions. Shirk in itself is an illogical decision. So when that person makes that decision to do shirk, they are always accountable for it, because you don't need to know anything other than have an aql, other than have logic, to be able to consider that this doesn't make sense. If I was to say, for example, there is another Allah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so there's two gods, so they're both all powerful and both infinite, then in that case then, who's going to have power over the other? How can it be that there can be two gods? That's rationally impossible, right? So all of the things that are shirk are rationally impossible. Is it rationally impossible that Allah grants some of his close servants the ability to be able to hear and fulfill our needs? Is that rationally impossible, really? Of course it isn't. If we believe that Allah has given them the permission to do so, and they are dependent completely on Allah's power, and the way that Allah has created them is in that way, and Allah has granted them that ability, then how can that be shirk? We've not made him equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've not said that they're independent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have not made their power equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is no area or angle that you can take in order to even view this as shirk. The question here, the fundamental question will be, did Allah give them the ability to fulfill and hear our needs? Not, is this shirk? Because shirk is something that's consistent. If, for example, I've got Mushtaba here, if I ask Mushtaba to help me or bring me some water, Allah's given him the ability to be able to do that for me, right? So that is fine. The same way, if I ask the Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam for a need of mine, for them to help me, and Allah has given them the ability, the same way that he gave, for example, Mushtaba the ability to help me in that case, then the principle is the same. Shirk is something that's consistent. It's either shirk all the time or it's never shirk. Right? The principle is exactly the same. Me asking Mushtaba and he has the ability to help me, me asking Ahlulbayt and they have the ability to help me. There's no difference within those two things. And the rational possibility of the Imams being able to have this ability negates the idea completely that it could even ever be shirk. So now the question is, did Allah give his servants the ability to be able to do this for us or not? Did he give the Ahlulbayt alayhim salam, the Imams of Ahlulbayt, the ability to be able to hear our needs and fulfill them? That is the fundamental question that we should be asking. Hopefully, at this point, it's clear why the question of shirk is not a sensible one and not one that is relevant to this discussion whatsoever. So this is where we ask the question, where do we see istighatha in the Qur'an and ahadith? So we want to take a simple example in the Qur'an, and that is of istighfar, seeking forgiveness. And that is something where forgiveness in the Qur'an has been mentioned as something that asking for Allah has to be also done through the Prophet. We see that in the Qur'an, forgiveness has layers, and we can see here that Allah says, in order for you to get forgiveness from me, you have to get forgiveness from the Prophet. And this is a nice, clear example whereby we would speak directly to the Prophet as per the order of the Qur'an in order for this to occur. And that obviously in this time would be across the curtain of Ghaib, because the Prophet ﷺ has passed away. He has moved away from this world. So in order for us to ask forgiveness from the Prophet, it would have to be across the curtain of Ghaib. We see in the Quran in ayah number 5 of Surah Al-Munafiqun, Allah says after the Basmala, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا يَسْتَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لَوَّوْا رُؤُوسَهُمْ وَرَأَيْتَهُمْ يَسُدُّونَ وَهُمْ مُسْتَكْبِرُونَ. He says, and when it is said to them, come, such that the Prophet can invoke Allah's mercy and his forgiveness for you, they twist their heads out of arrogance, and you will see them turn away in pride. So we see here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling them to go to the Prophet to ask for forgiveness. And these people are what? They're arrogant. The question you should ask here is, why is there an emphasis on going to the Prophet? Why does the Prophet have to ask for forgiveness? Can Allah not hear them if they ask for forgiveness themselves? Is Allah not closer to them than their jugular vein? Does Allah not say in the Qur'an, Id'uni astajib lakum, I'll call upon me and I'll answer you? Of course He does. He is closer to them. All of those things are true. Allah is close to them. He can hear them asking for forgiveness anyway, but He has made the Prophet the vessel of them asking for forgiveness in this ayah. This is a precedent that Allah set down. Then you have another ayah of the Qur'an. In ayah number 64 of Surah An-Nisa, Allah says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن رَسُولٍ إِلَّا لِيُطَاعَ بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. We have not sent a messenger except that he should be obeyed by the permission of Allah. وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ إِذْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ جَاءُوكَ فَاسْتَغْفِرُوا اللَّهَ وَاسْتَغْفَرَ لَهُمُ الرَّسُولُ لَوَجَدُوا اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا. Allah says, and if only when they had oppressed themselves, they had come to you, talking to the Prophet, Ja'uka, such that Allah could forgive them and the Rasul could also ask for forgiveness for them. In that situation, they would have found that Allah would be forgiving and merciful. So Allah has set another precedent here again. This is a very interesting verse. It is one that's timeless. It is one where Allah is asking you to go to the Prophet and ask him for forgiveness and ask him to invoke Allah's forgiveness for you. So He set that precedent again. And this is the example that we're taking of istighfar in the Qur'an. Those are two ayats where Allah sets this precedent of seeking forgiveness from the Prophet in order for Allah to forgive you. And in relation to this verse of the Qur'an that we just read, where Allah says, when they had oppressed themselves, they should have come to you so that Allah could forgive them and that the Rasul could also forgive them. We see a hadith in Al-Kafi with regards to this very ayah of the Qur'an. We see in Kitab al-Hajj from the 4th volume of Kitab al-Kafi, we see a narration from Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, narrated by Muawiyah ibn Ammar. He says, if you enter Medina, then do ghusl before you enter Medina or when you enter Medina. And then he says, go towards the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. And then he gives some directions of where to stand and how to stand, the adab of how to do the ziyarah of Rasulullah ﷺ. So he says, this is where you stand. And then he mentions, say this ziyarah when you go to visit Rasulullah. And it's a bit of a long one, so I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just looking at the last part of the ziyarah. He says, say this. He says, Allahumma innaka qulta ولو أنهم إذ ظلموا أنفسهم جاءوك فاستغفروا الله واستغفر لهم الرسول لوجدوا الله توابا رحيما. He says, say to Allah at this point, O Allah, indeed you have said in the Qur'an that if only when they had oppressed themselves, they had come towards you so that Allah could forgive them and that the Rasul could ask for forgiveness on their behalf, they would have found that Allah would be all forgiving and merciful. And then after having recited the ayah, we say, وَإِنِّي أَتَيْتُ نَبِيَّكَ مُسْتَغْفِرًا تَائِبًا مِّن ذُنُوبِي وَإِنِّي أَتَوَجَّهُ بِكَ إِلَى اللَّهِ رَبِّي وَرَبَّكَ لِيَغْفِرَ لِي ذُنُوبِي. You would say to Rasulullah at this point, first you're speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you say, I have come towards your Prophet as you have said. I've come here mustaghfiran, ta'iban. I've come here asking for forgiveness, feeling repentful with regards to my sins. And then you switch towards the Prophet, وَإِنِّي أَتَوَجَّهُ بِكَ إِلَى اللَّهِ رَبِّي وَرَبَّكَ لِيَغْفِرَ لِي ذُنُوبِي. And I have turned towards you, O Prophet, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, towards such that I can use you as an interceder towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is my Lord and your Lord, such that He can forgive my sins. And you see here then the narration mentions that if you are to have any hajats, then you should ask them at the qabr of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you see here that the narration mentions the ayah of the Qur'an very clearly, in that this is something that we should do. The Imam has said, go towards the Prophet's grave and make this dua and mention that this is the ayah of the Qur'an by which it's order I have come here and I've asked for forgiveness at the grave of Rasulullah across the curtain of Ghaib. And this is a clear form of Istighatha, because here you address the Prophet directly in asking him to ask forgiveness on your behalf as an intercessor for you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you to receive forgiveness. And of course we do that because Rasulullah is a closest servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the closest servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Me asking for forgiveness on my own does not hold the same weight as Rasulullah asking for forgiveness on my behalf. That's why you see that this example is emphasized even in the Qur'an and the Hadith. Now, although this is a clear form and example of Istighatha, some people may argue, okay, so this is restricted to forgiveness. This is only in the situation where you have committed sins and you need to ask for forgiveness. That's when you would go to Rasulullah and you would ask him for forgiveness, but you wouldn't ask him for your needs. That's what some people would say when looking at these hadith or this ayah of the Qur'an. So what we would need to do is we would need to show a more general example whereby someone is able to ask their needs, so that we can show that the principle mentioned in this verse where we spoke about forgiveness is not restricted to just forgiveness. It is a principle that can be built upon for us to be able to ask for our hajat and for our needs from the Prophet or from the Imams alayhi salam. So in order to do that, we're going to look at a few narrations with regards to the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And we find these narrations in our most classical works of hadith, in Al-Kafi and in Kamil al-Ziyarat. So in Kamil al-Ziyarat, we have this narration from Imam Sadiq alayhi wasalam where he speaks about the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein. He says, if you would like to do the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein, إِذَا أَرَدْتَ زِيَارَةَ الْحُسَيْنِ, if you have made the niyyah or you are going towards ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein, فَزُرْهُ وَأَنْتَ كَئِيبٌ حَزِينٌ مَكْرُوبٌ, go towards him while you are in an extreme state of sadness and you have dust upon you. Yeah, you've reached there in a place in a harsh way. Like for example, when we do the walk from Najaf to Karbala, you get to Karbala and you're all dusty and sweaty and all sorts, right? That is the way that you should approach Karbala. Ja'i'un atshan, he says, get there hungry and thirsty. He says, فَإِنَّ الْحُسَيْنِ قُتِلَ حَزِينًا مَكْرُوبًا شَأْثًا مُغْبِرًا جَائِعًا أَتْشَانًا, because this is the state that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was killed in. Then Imam al-Sadiq says, وَسَلْحُ الْحَوَائِجِ, he says, and ask him for your needs. This is one of the adab of the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. وَانْصَرِفْ عَنْهُ وَلَا تَتَّخِذُهُ وَطَنًا, he says, and once you get there, you do your ziyarah, don't spend too long there in Karbala, because it's makruh if you are a za'ir and you're coming there to spend too long in that area. So you do the ziyarah, and as soon as you are able to leave the city, you should leave. So this is what the narration is saying. The important part here is وَسَلْهُ الْهَوَائِجِ, ask him for your needs. This is an order from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and this is a narration in Kamil al-Ziyarat. This is the book that was written by Ibn Qawlawayh, which is one of our most classical and most authentic books. There are even today, there are from the Marajit, from the scholars that say every single narrator that is mentioned in this book, just by virtue of being in this book, is an authentic and a trustworthy narrator, just because he was mentioned in Kamil Ziyarat. So that's the standard of narration that we are speaking about in Kamil Ziyarat. And this also, if we take a look into the chain, there are those also that consider this chain to be at the highest level of authenticity. So we see here that the Imam is encouraging the Shia, and he has added it as an etiquette of the ziyarah, that when you go towards Imam al-Hussein, you ask him for your needs. And this is much more general. You can see that the principle that we spoke about from the ayat of the Qur'an with regards to forgiveness are not restricted to forgiveness. This is going towards Imam al-Hussein in a way that you are disheveled, you are sad, in a broken state. Right? You're hungry, you're thirsty, and at that point you ask Imam al-Hussein for your needs. This is the adab of ziyarah. We have the same narration in Al-Kafi. It comes through the same chain as well. So the Imam, he says the same hadith here. It's also mentioned in Al-Kafi in Kitab al-Hajj. So you can see that this is a narration that is famous and was in our classical books. And the Imam set this as a precedent, as adab of ziyarah, that we ask Imam al-Hussein for our needs. So now we've seen a few examples from the Qur'an and the Sunnah where we see this example of going towards the Prophet and towards the Imams alayhi salam in order for us to ask them our needs. We started first of all with the principle of the Qur'an in forgiveness, where Allah orders us to go towards the Prophet in order for him to invoke forgiveness for us. So we see that, and then we see a less restricted version of it built upon in the ahadith that we read again, where we see that one of the adab of the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is to ask him for our needs. And on top of that, this is something that goes back to our classical works of hadith. This is something in Kamil Ziyarat in Al-Kafi. I'm not bringing you Mustadrak al-Wasail that was written in the last 500 years, or Bihar al-Anwar, that's a secondary source that was written in the last 600, 700 years. I'm bringing you our classical books with the highest level of authenticity in their narrations. Kamil Ziyarat is a book that is not a joke whatsoever. This is a book, like I mentioned, that the scholars, they consider it to be one of the most authentic works from our classical books. So now we want to move on to another part of the discussion. We want to speak about the concept of ziyarah. So sometimes I ask myself this question: what problem can a Shi'i have with Istighatha? What's the problem that they have? Is it that, for example, maybe the Imam can't hear me because he's passed away, he's moved on from this world, so maybe he can't hear me? Because that's the bare minimum, isn't it? At the very least, if the Imam can hear you, then he can invoke Allah on your behalf. And that would be Istighatha too. So what is the problem here? The bare minimum is that some people might think, can the Imam hear me? Or, you know, by me saying that the Imam can hear me, am I saying that he's all present? And, you know, am I comparing him to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in being able to hear all of our voices at one time? The answer to that is that we have a concept known as ziyarah. In our Shi'i classical works, we have tons and tons and tons of ziyarat. The whole concept of ziyarah is based on the idea that you go towards these infallible Imams, you go towards the Prophet, you go towards Fatima Zahra, and you read these ziyarat, and you address them and you speak to them. You say, Assalamu alayka so-and-so, Assalamu alayka so-and-so. So you're speaking to the individual and the infallible themselves. So this is in itself a proof that they can hear you. Otherwise, we wouldn't have tons and tons of ziyarat. So if you have this issue and you think, can the Imam hear me? Or you want to negate the idea that the Imam can hear you, then you would have to throw out our whole rich corpus of ziyarat. And by doing so, you would have to throw out all of your principles of understanding and accepting ahadith as well, because there's just so many of them that you wouldn't be able to chuck out ziyarah as a concept, as a Shi'i, that it's not a possible thing. So the bare minimum is what? That we accept that the concept of ziyarah means that the Imam can hear me. At the very least, at the bare minimum, if I say to Ya Rasulullah, ask Allah on my behalf for this and this and this, if that's the bare minimum, without me asking for Rasulullah to grant it himself, which he is able to do. But the bare minimum, if I say to Ya Rasulullah, invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on my behalf to grant me this, this and this. That is something that we do basically in our ziyarat, literally. So it's a very obvious thing that the Prophets and the Imams alayhi salam can hear us across the curtain of Ghaib. This is something that is, if you want to reject that, then you're throwing out all of our classical works, and you should reconsider your tashayyuh. You should reconsider your Shi'ism if you're willing to throw out all of our classical works just so that you can prove that the Prophets and the Imams can't hear me. And on top of that, I want to remind you, in order to build the picture completely, and because I don't want to repeat myself, and we have spoken about a lot of concepts that directly relate to this topic of Istighatha, I want to take you back and remind you of a few episodes of Jumah Nights in the past that I would definitely suggest and recommend that you would watch if you want to understand this concept in a more overview sense, so that the picture can be even clearer than where it is, inshallah. So if someone wants to understand this topic a little bit better and where I'm coming from, I would suggest that you should watch the 2 episodes that were before this with regards to Ilmul Ghaib and Wilaya Takwiniya, and prior to that, the episode that's called There Is No Tawheed Without Imam Ali alayhi salam. These are the 3 episodes I would suggest are completely and directly related to this topic and will give a bigger picture with regards to this topic if you are somebody that is looking for answers here and you still have doubts after having spoken about these ayat and these ahadith. So the concept of turning towards Ahlulbayt alayhi salam, asking them for our needs as something that Allah has given them the ability to do for us, is something that we find across the Qur'an, as we've discussed, across the ahadith, as we've discussed, and as I always say, there is symmetry between the Qur'an, the ahadith and the ziyarat. So I want to read a few lines for you from Ziyarat Jamia, and this is where we end, inshallah. We see in Ziyarat Jamia where the Imam teaches us to say, "Man arada Allah bada'a bikum, وَمَنْ وَحَدَهُ قَبِلَ عَنْكُمْ وَمَنْ قَصَدَهُ تَوَجَّهَ إِلَيْكُمْ." This is very clear in that it says, whomsoever wants Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he begins with you, and whomsoever professes his oneness accepts your wilaya, and whomsoever wants to go towards Allah, وَمَنْ قَصَدَهُ تَوَجَّهَ إِلَيْكُمْ, he faces towards you in your direction. So this is a very general statement. However, we can see how it directly relates to Istighatha, in that when you want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you turn towards the Ahlulbayt alayhi salam as the representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are the representatives of Allah. When we say Assalamu alayka ya hujjatullah, a lot of the time this word that we use, hujjatullah, we don't deep how high that status is, to be the representative and the proof of Allah upon earth. His proof, Allah's proof upon earth. That is the individual that you would need to turn towards, because first of all, he brought you the religion. Without him, you didn't even know the religion, and now you want to skip him. You don't want him to be part of your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not possible. That person is the one who brought you the religion. It is necessary for you to know him and understand him and what he's saying in order to broaden and strengthen your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we say, وَمَنْ وَحَدَهُ قَبِلَ أَنْكُمْ. The one who truly professes the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to be somebody that has accepted the wilayah of the Imams in its entirety. Otherwise, how are you going to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And that's something we spoke about in There Is No Tawheed Without Imam Ali. That episode is really, really important in understanding this. And this last line is completely and directly linked to Istighatha when we say, وَمَنْ قَصَدَهُ تَوَجَّهَ إِلَيْكُمْ. The one who intends the direction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he turns towards you. So they are the point of contact. They are the point that you should go towards in order for you to get your needs. And then with regards to the understanding of forgiveness that we read in the Qur'an, look at the symmetry here again. We say, Ya wali Allah, inna bayni wa bayna Allah azza wa jal dhunuban la ya'ti alayha illa ridhakum, fabihaqqi man i'tamanakum ala sirrihi wastar'akum amra khalqihi wa qarana ta'atakum bi ta'atihi lama stawhabtum dhunubi wa kuntum shufa'a'i. He says, the Imam teaches us to say, Ya Waliullah, O guardian of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, O Wali of Allah, there are indeed between me and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are sins that cannot be erased except by your pleasure. Illa ridhakum. فَبِحَقِّ مَنْ اِعْتَمَنَكُمْ عَلَى سِرِّهِ وَاسْتَرْعَاكُمْ أَمْرَ خَلْقِهِ. He says, so for the sake of the one who made you the safeguarders of his secrets, Yeah, the one who made you, the one who supervised his affairs, and the one who attached his obedience to your obedience. So the obedience of Allah is the obedience of Ahlulbayt alayhi salam. لَمَسْتَوْحَبْتُمْ ذُنُوبِي, that you absolve me of my sins. So you see there's the symmetry that we go towards the Imams alayhi salam, and this ziyarah jami'ah is for all of the Ahlulbayt alayhi salam. So all of them can be addressed with this ziyarah. So we see that symmetry again with regards to forgiveness, going towards them and asking for forgiveness and asking them to invoke Allah's forgiveness for you. And clearer than all of these, we have this in this other passage, is clear with regards to the needs that we have and asking the Imams for them. We say مستشفئ إلى الله عز وجل بكم ومتقرب بكم إليه ومقدمكم أمام طلبتي وحوائجي وإرادتي في كل أحوالي وأموري. He says, we are seeking your intercession towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking closeness to Allah through you, and we have placed before you our needs, our wants and our desires in all of our matters and affairs. So this is where we see clearly our needs. We put them before Ahlulbayt alayhi salam in order to get them closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see that it's not coincidence that it mentions it in the same passage. مستشفع الله عز وجل بكم ومتقرب بكم ومقدمكم أمام طلبتي وحوائجي وإرادتي في كل أحوالي وأموري. That we put our needs and our wants and our desires all in front of the Imam of our time alayhi salam. And he is the one who is our vessel in order to get our needs granted. And who else would you go towards to get your needs granted other than the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam? This is why at the end of Ziyarah Jami'ah, what do we end by saying? We say, Allahumma inni law wajadtu shufa'a aqrab ilayka min Muhammadin wa ahli baytihi al-akhyar al-a'immatul abrar laj'altuhum shufa'i. You say very clearly, oh Allah, if I knew of intercessors that are closer to you than Muhammad and his Ahlul Bayt and the A'imma that are virtuous and pious, then I would have made them my intercessors. If I knew of anyone other than the Imams and the Ahlul Bayt, then I would have made them my intercessors. How can you put anybody else in the position of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam? How can you even question in your mind that do these people have the ability to help me? Do these people have the ability to grant me my needs? These are the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. These are the people that you should read Ziyarah Jami'ah. All of us, we should make a habit of reading Ziyarah Jami'ah all the time, because this is a clear, muhkam piece of literature in which we are able to understand the status of the Imams alayhi salam, such that these questions don't get asked. After we say لَجَعَلْتُمْ شُفَعَاءِ, if I knew anyone other than the Ahlul Bayt, I would have made them my intercessors. فَبِحَقِّهِمُ الَّذِي أَوْجَبْتَ لَهُمْ عَلَيْكَ. So the right that you have made for them upon you, أَسْأَلُكَ أَن تُدْخِلَنِي فِي جُمْلَةِ الْعَارَفِينَ بِهِمْ وَبِحَقِّهِمْ. You see, after that, after having said that these are the shufa'a, if I was to know anybody else, I would have made them my intercessors. But I've made Ahlul Bayt my intercessors. What do you ask Allah? You say that you give me ma'rifah of them. Make me of the arafina bihim wa bihaqihim. Make me from those who recognize their status and their rights. You see, this here, it shows you that the journey is from them, through them and to them. This is the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. This is where your journey should begin and your journey should end. They are the path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the Qur'an and the ahadith and ziyarat. All of them are symmetrical. You can see that the same meaning and the same concept of the Istighatha is found in the Qur'an, in the ahadith and in the ziyarat. So in order to conclude, I just want to give a summary of points that we've discussed today. First of all, we spoke about the principle of forgiveness in the Qur'an, whereby Allah makes the Prophet the vessel for asking for forgiveness. Then we display the symmetry between this idea and the hadith, where we see that this is not something that's restricted, rather that's something that applies to our time as well. Then we explained how this principle widens even further with regards to the ziyarat of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, whereby we go towards him and we ask him for our needs as per the hadith of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam that we find in Kamil al-Ziyarat and we find in al-Kafi. And there are many other narrations that we haven't gone through today. Then we spoke about the concept of ziyarah itself, the actual foundation of ziyarah itself. You see, with the opposing sect, they don't even have this concept of ziyarat. They don't have nusus, they don't have text of long ziyarat. They don't have that. So of course they can actually discuss that. For us, we have ziyarat. So this concept of ziyarah is actually one that is rooted in istighatha and in addressing the prophets and the imams directly across the curtain of ghaib. And then you would inshallah be able to have a clear picture from everything that we've discussed today, from the Qur'an, from the ahadith, and from the ziyarat, and you can see a clear level of symmetry among all three of them. I hope that's been a beneficial discussion for you today, and I hope that you've learned something. Inshallah, next week we're going to be speaking about the infamous question, where is imamah in the Quran? Where that will be the last episode with regards to the series on the maqamat of the imams, and then we'll be moving on inshallah to a series with regards to death and barzakh. And I'll see you again for that next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.